Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Susie Marzola. I'm here on behalf of the ACOTE Committee Chair for AIA East Bay, who's presenting to a council meeting tonight, Ned Reifenstein. So you get me instead. Yes, Nolan Tam. Where did Chris go? Didn't I see Chris? He'll be back. Okay, good. And this is a program that's been put on by the AIA East Bay Committee on the Environment. I'm very honored to introduce our guest speaker this evening, Corey Squire, who's here with us, and who can be described as nothing less than a champion for sustainable design and for the planet and for the natural environment and all those things you saw written up and down the stairs with those great quotes. Corey's also an architect. He's an associate principal and director of sustainability at Bora Architecture. He's an alum of Lake Plato and of SQ Dumas and Ripple. Rolls off the tongue. And a career that began with an undergraduate degree in environmental sciences, a master's of architecture. These have taken him from New York to Oberlin, to New Orleans, to San Antonio, to Portland, and occasionally to the Bay Area, which is great for us. His work has been focused on all things environmental design, I should say, in all sorts of formats: studying and teaching, conducting research, authoring publications, running workshops like he did with us today in our office, and of course, designing high-performing buildings. In 12 years since graduate, where do you get the time, Corey? What did you buy time in a program that we need to be made aware of? Corey has become a very important voice in our profession, advocating for beautiful buildings that positively affect the natural world, or you put it in your book, that exemplify design excellence. Of his many, many notable accomplishments, particularly pertaining to AIA, Corey was the lead author on AIA's framework for design excellence and the co-creator of AIA Top 10 Toolkit, which are great resources and you should have handy next to your desk, on your computer, on your desktop. Another great accomplishment and resource that one should have, with Post-it notes and thumbed next to their desk, is this book, a recent publication, People, Planet, Design, a practical, and it is very practical, guide to realizing architecture's potential, which is another one of those things you should have very handy. So it's the topic of our presentation and discussion this evening. So let's get to it and join me in welcoming Corey. Thank you. Uh-oh, I think I touched him. Oh, that was.
Oh. Thank you, Susie. Okay, let me pull it up. Oh, and I'll minimize the zoom. All right, little thing in the corner, should be fine. Okay, well, thanks for coming today. My name is Corey Squire. I'm going to talk a little bit about my new book, People, Planet, Design, a practical guide for realizing architecture's potential. Quick background, thank you for the introduction, Susie. At Bora Architecture in Portland, Oregon, the firm that does architecture, interiors, experiential design. And everything that we do at this practice is through the lens of climate, health, and equity. And this is kind of a new thing at Bora. It's something that we kind of worked together on over the past few years. And kind of through this idea that any firm can kind of advance towards a focus on sustainability and hopefully, like the book describes, realize architecture's potential. I spent a number of years consulting with firms across the country on with my practice Department of Sustainability. firms in a lot of different regions that did a lot of different types of work. And it seemed like everybody was challenged with the same things, which was kind of, I know what to do. We really care deeply about sustainability, but we just not been able to kind of get it done. I realized through my consulting work that everyone was basically facing the same challenges. So a lot of the experience from that kind of informed my work in this book. So fundamentally, I like to say this is a book about design, technically sustainable design, but design is the key focus here, right? We know that everybody wants healthy, equitable, sustainable buildings. We know that it's possible. We have all the technology to be able to do this, but so often sustainability seems kind of just out of reach. So the goal for this book was to unite sustainability and design into this one thing that everybody is working towards and wants to accomplish. Communicate architecture's potential. We have, as a profession, architects have so much to offer, buildings have so much to offer, yet time and time again, they don't offer everything they can. And then identify the barriers to better design, to design excellence, to sustainability, and then show how they can be eliminated, right? There's real challenges that the profession faces. Complexity. We're asked as architects to do a lot of different things. We have to be experts in 100 different fields, and over time, we have to do more and more and more, often with limited budgets, limited schedules. There's a challenge of prioritization, right? When you look at something sustainability through the lens of something like a LEED checklist, there's all these different things, and then there's like these little points next to it, right? It's a really bad way of understanding. Not everything is as valuable as anything else. So for instance, window wall ratio is immensely important on lots of different areas. Low flow fixtures, you just kind of follow the code and you buy better faucets. There's a challenge of purpose. Why are we doing what we're doing, right? At my practices, energy modeling is incredibly important in the places that I've worked, but not everybody understands that the purpose of an energy model is to improve design to the ultimate goal of human thriving, not to check a box that we had an energy model. And there's an ever-present challenge of distraction, right? There are products out there, maybe simple energy modeling tools, maybe new technologies that kind of sell ideas to architects, like do this thing and it'll solve all your problems. But buying something is not going to kind of suffice as a vision of what we actually want to accomplish as a profession or as an individual practice. So the book attempts to define a holistic approach to design excellence through this uniting of sustainability and design. The process that I put together while writing the book was to start with the right outcomes. What do we want to achieve with our practice, right? Human health, equity, carbon reduction, ecology seems like a really good place to start. And then to trace each of these outcomes back to relevant building systems. For instance, the structure, the air system, the finishes within a building. What you can then do is align an outcome and a system. And so for instance, if you want to reduce carbon, the relevant building system might be windows and the strategy is the facade organization, right? Or human health is especially relevant to the air system of a building, and airtight construction might be that most effective strategy. If equity is important, then looking at the finishes as a system and understanding material sourcing. So kind of identifying outcomes, looking at building systems, combining those two to identify the most effective design strategies. But then step four is to create an environment to make that all happen, right? And that has to do with kind of the culture of the environment. And this could be the culture of an individual practice. This could be the culture of our profession. So what do I mean by that? Having a shared mission and vision for what we want to accomplish, right? Having the right access to knowledge, being able to effectively communicate, establishing good incentives so that people do the right thing within the design process, safety through social belonging, and then living stated values. And if you can combine the right culture and the right knowledge, we can achieve really high performing buildings. So this was a precedent of mine. If you might be familiar with this book, but basically it tries to distill cooking down to some fundamental elements: salt, fat, acid, and heat. And it says, like, you don't need a recipe. If you add more salt, your lentils are going to taste better, all along those lines. So this was my goal, to kind of distill sustainability down to its fundamental elements. I think sustainable architecture for design is a little bit more complicated than cooking. There was more than just 4 elements, but this was the ultimate goal. And then throughout the book, I want to use illustrations to kind of highlight key themes. Elena Zambrano is my wife and also the illustrator of the book, and we collaborated on kind of choosing the topics that we thought would be most relevant and kind of need some sort of image. So that's a little bit about the book, but I want to really dig into kind of the premise, which I set forth in the first chapter. And it's that architecture has a problem today. We spend virtually all of our time in buildings or in and around them. We invest huge amounts of capital into the built environment, and we're facing all of these serious, urgent societal crises, right? Climate change, wildfire smoke, civil unrest, whatever it is. But architecture design, as it currently exists, is not serving our needs, right? Buildings are the primary source of carbon emissions, more than 40% from the 2030 challenge. We build these buildings and we fill them with chemicals that we already know to be hazardous. And then we poison people elsewhere in the process of manufacturing those hazardous chemicals. So often it seems during the design process that outcomes are predetermined, right? Like relevant decisions have already been made by a budget or by codes or by the standards of whatever facility you're working at. And then too often our creativity gets misdirected towards outcomes that really don't matter, right? So like here's a building, the goal was to provide some sort of transparency, but in reality we just get glare, right? Here's a building, Renzo Piano project in Italy, where the roof is made of hammered lead to make reference to history, even though it's objectively poisonous. So it could seem like as a profession, we're just focusing on the wrong thing, even though the outcome of our work is causing kind of a big chunk of our problems. So are we fiddling as Rome is burning, right? How did architecture move so far away from human needs? And then how can we get back? So this is what I explore in the book, this idea that there were 2 schisms over the past 100 years or so that kind of led us to where we are today. The first one was the separation of form and function. And I think this is a kind of a fundamental architectural concept that relates very closely to sustainable design. So here's an aerial of Toledo, Spain. The urban form of this city served a necessary function, right? Most of the space is buildings, but there's still kind of roads that people can travel through. The buildings can't get through too deep because you need courtyards to get access to light, right? Here's Penn Station in New York as it looked a few decades ago. If you wanted to bring light into buildings, you need to have appropriate sized windows. But all this changed when we started relying on fossil fuels to solve the problem that historically has been solved by design, right? So we didn't need to have windows to provide light anymore. So we decided this is fine. People can stay in this space all day, right? Or we didn't need to be able to carry ourselves, walk from building to building. So we created this other environment, again, powered by fossil fuels, but resulted in this form that doesn't serve any function. So cheap energy, oil and gas and coal, freed design from physical constraints. We didn't have to design in line with nature anymore. We didn't have to use passive strategies anymore. But what did we gain by doing this, right? We gained these sprawled out cities. We gained poor interior environments. We gained the ability to have all glass facades that look the same on all sides because it didn't matter where the sun was. But without function, we lose touch with meaning, right? So form that provides function is where good design comes from. And I think that's pretty fundamental. Also, function is the people part. So if we say we don't need to provide great daylighting, people can just sit in their cubicles with the fluorescents like 100 feet from the windows. We're claiming that to be function, but it actually is working against our needs. So here's the analogy that I use in the book. I talk about the difference between pure form, which kind of might be art, sculpture, pure function, something that serves a practical purpose, but is not loved or beautiful in any way. And then what buildings are supposed to be, or other objects like this bicycle, is this combination of form and function, right? The bicycle is a beautiful form, but it looks a certain way because that's the only way that it would be able to function for its intended purpose. And what's really interesting about the bicycle, for instance, is let's say you wanted to kind of enhance that function. You want the bicycle to go faster. The form becomes more interesting, right? Now we have these smooth lines for aerodynamics. We have this solid rear wheel. We have a whole new position. If we had a different function in mind, right, we can create a different form, and that also serves its intended purpose. But what we're asking our buildings to do today is kind of closer to this, right? There is no function that's served by this form. But what this is a western-facing window, right? Or this is a highway overpass that takes people back and forth between different places, or it's an unnecessary cantilever that uses a huge amount of embodied carbon when other structural systems or other designs would do. We need to recognize that just because we like a form doesn't mean that it's a good form, doesn't mean that it works, right? We don't just say, I want to have square tires because I have a preference for square tires, because you wouldn't get anywhere. But people are still saying, I have a preference for this all glass environment, even though it functionally doesn't work. So that was the first schism, the separation of form and function. The other one was a schism between sustainability and design. So if we think back 100 years, again, before the fossil fuel era, there was no sustainable building. Every building was sustainable because every building had to provide function based on its environment. So here's a warehouse about 100 years old. This is actually Bora's office before we renovated it. And it's a completely passively operated building. The materials are locally harvested wood. It has excellent daylighting from side lighting and skylights. But what happened, there was rather than kind of returning to this idea of we already knew what form and function looked like because many traditional buildings kind of align these things by necessity. In the 70s, there was this backlash against sustainability, against design for design's sake, and ended up in these really weird things, right? And so there was the era of earthships, where sustainability was just this weird reaction to bad design, but bad design in itself as well. And it created this dichotomy, right? The dichotomy is that sustainability is this kind of additive approach where you have features flying out, and then there's real design, which has to look good, right? It doesn't matter how the sustainable building looks, and it doesn't matter how the beautiful building performs. And this is a trap that the profession has fallen into, and I think that we need to kind of back our way out of this. In reality, good design needs to do all of it, right? You can't have a beautiful building that pollutes or causes any sort of respiratory disease or unnecessary carbon or whatever else. But you also can't have sustainable, quote unquote, sustainable buildings that look so ridiculous that no one wants to have anything to do with them. So in the book, I described this as the difference between traditional practice and design excellence. And this is a takeoff of the framework for design excellence, which I spent some time working on and kind of publicizing over the past 5 or 6 years. So traditional practice, I define the book as just like business as usual, how we're doing things today, right? Resulting in the subpar outcomes that we all kind of have expected. Design excellence is how do we reach architecture's potential? So you could look at this on a variety of categories, right? So traditional practice from the perspective of health says that ventilation is there to control odor, and filtration of air systems protects the coils of the mechanical system from dust. But architectural potential is to have indoor air quality that reduces pathogens, that supplies enough oxygen so that we can kind of reach our highest mental acuity, right? From a carbon standpoint, right? Currently, buildings contribute 40% of carbon emissions. But architectural potential is we can either greatly reduce that or we can even sequester carbon. And then we can go through this, but all the way on the bottom, there's no reason that buildings can't be beautiful in both contexts. So spent a lot of time in this book talking about form and function, because I think form and function is the fundamental way of understanding sustainability. But it's clear that function is more complicated than it used to be. And part of that is because interconnected supply chains, things are coming from all over the world. And small impacts, small decisions can have far-reaching impacts. So in the book, I divide the concept of function into different orders, right? Traditionally, we think about function in what I'm describing as first order function, which is usefulness in a specific moment, in a time and space. So in this definition, vinyl flooring is perfectly functional. right? It's easy to clean, it's cheap, it looks however you want it. But second order function is usefulness over time. And it's clear that vinyl flooring is not useful over time because if it's causing respiratory disease, if it's off-gassing, if it has a dirty manufacturing process, right? If you were gonna spend time in the space and your health is going to deteriorate over time, it can't be functional. And then third order function goes broader than that. It's usefulness over time and space, right? And it's not just kind of the installation of the product or the strategy in the building over the life of the building, but it's also everybody else who is touched by this, right? So if you have an easy to clean floor at the expense of somebody else getting sick somewhere else, again, we can't call that function. So because of the interconnectedness of our supply chains, of our world, right, we have to kind of fully recognize that a really beautiful building that causes unnecessary harm elsewhere, we can no longer consider that good design. And I think this is the kind of the fundamental break from the past. This is what the framework for design excellence of the AA that's the point that the framework tried to make, which is we have to think broader. We have to think in terms of function today, function over time, and how our decisions are impacting kind of far-reaching communities. So the goal, which I described in the book, is practice transformation. Lots of firms out there care deeply about sustainability, and a lot of firms have one project that's their high-performing project that they're very proud of. And that's all great, right? But true sustainability can't be the one project where everything goes right? Where the client is super excited or for whatever, or it's a nature park, so it fits in perfectly with the program. Fundamentally, sustainability is at the level of the practice, and decisions that a practice makes will influence the performance of all their projects. So if we want a sustainable profession, if we want high-performing buildings that reach architecture's potential, we need to transform practice. And that's kind of fundamentally what this book is about. It's a practical guide for reaching architecture's potential, but a practical guide of getting there by transforming architectural practice. So the book is divided into three parts. The first part is theory, and a lot of the theory is what I described already, form and function, right? How do we transform practice? By adopting a unified vision of good design. And a lot of that has to do with cost. So this is what I call the central dogma of sustainable design, is that it costs more. It's not actually true, but everybody believes it, right? People who care about sustainability believe it. People who don't care about sustainability believe it. Architects believe it. Clients believe it. Contractors believe it, but it's not actually true. And I think it's fairly clear to show that it's not actually true, right? So here's a graph. We have project budget on the horizontal axis, project performance on the vertical axis. And if your projects are going to be minimally compliant, you're going to have low budget, you're going to have low performance, right? But it's also possible to have a really expensive project that doesn't perform well with like a LEED platinum. Like if you go to downtown Houston, all those glass towers that are all the oil executive headquarters, they all have LEED platinum plaques. None of them perform well, and they're probably very expensive. Now, for a limited budget, if you focus on different strategies, like a Passive House multifamily project in the Northeast, kind of consistently passive house projects are coming in less expensive than traditional projects. And they're much less expensive to operate. And that's just about prioritizing what's really important, the enclosure, right? Not a checklist with a lot of really weird divergent things. And if you want to spend a lot of money and get high performance, there's something like the Living Building Challenge, and you can spend as much money as you want to. But what this graph shows is that you can get any level of performance on any budget, right? There's no clear correlation between high performance and cost. Actually, for single-family residential, it's the opposite, right? The higher the budget for single-family residential, the lower the performance, right? And that's fairly clear as well. So, but cost is not just this universal thing in the universe. Cost is based on priorities, and priorities are based on knowledge and value. And I think this is fundamental for architects to understand. We prioritize things like square footage at the expense of prioritizing something like, I don't know, high performance systems or better insulation. And that's based on our values, right? If I value a larger space rather than value a higher performance space, that's what's going to do the project, and that's going to influence the cost. But it's not just value. Well, it's not just value, it's also knowledge, right? Because knowledge informs your values to a certain degree. This is our leverage point with our clients, right? If we could talk about other options, if we can educate clients on outcomes, if we can say, you'll be healthier if we do this, right? And maybe that costs a little bit more, but maybe we take the cost out of something else. And our values change based on new knowledge, our priorities change, the project changes, the cost stays the same. So an example here is commercial kitchens, right? Historically, commercial kitchens have had a lot of, they've been gas heavy, which results in high ventilation rates, which results in very warm, hot environments, pretty uncomfortable. But slowly, commercial kitchens have been shifting over to induction. Initially, there was a lot of pushback because there was a value for gas and there was a knowledge or presumed knowledge that gas is easier to cook with or results better. As more people got to learn about induction, and they realized you have the same temperature control, but the space is cooler and it's not as loud, and it's not as hot, and it's healthier because we're not burning things in the space. Knowledge changed values, values change priorities, and commercial kitchens are pretty universally at this point shifting over to induction. So in my book, I talk about this idea of the battlefield of ideas, and this is the kind of the call for conversation within the design team, among the client, among the consultant, to really discuss what we're doing and not assume certain things, right? It's very easy to say, we're gonna have a commercial kitchen, we're gonna have gas. But instead, we looked at different options, we discussed them, we talked about pros and cons, and my hope is that the better option will end up winning. So an example for this, a project that I was working on recently in Portland, it was a branch of the public library, and they have a standard against operable windows. And who knows why they had that standard? Somebody said for maintenance, somebody said because people were throwing books out of windows. Nobody knows, none of it was true. And they wanted to just end the conversation. They wanted to say, nope, that's our standard, no operable windows. And we said there are really convincing reasons why we think that you should have operable windows in your project. And we wrote a memo and we described all of the benefits that the client would get from operable windows from a resiliency standpoint, from a health standpoint, from a energy efficiency standpoint, from a connection of nature standpoint. And they wrote back another memo, counterpointing all of ours. And then we wrote back another memo. And the ending result was that we got operable windows, and not just that project, but their standards changed because we were able to discuss the values that we thought were important, educate them, and they were able, because of that new knowledge, their values changed, their priorities changed, and our project ended up being better. So just another example from the book, like any design strategy we can look at through the lens of value to the client, the lens of kind of cost, benefit, impact, and we can lay these things out, and we need to have these conversations. But it's important to kind of almost to convince the client to have these conversations, or from within a practice to dedicate the time to understanding what the best options are. So, and that leads into kind of part 2 of the book. So part 1 is theory, part 2 is practice. And from the perspective of practice, how do we transform practice? It's by designing a culture that leads to desired outcomes. So one thing that I learned from the various places that I worked and the various firms I consulted with is that the environment informs design. And it could be the physical environment that you're working, it could be an office space, or it's the cultural environment, right? It is whose opinions carry weight, how people communicate, what ideas are considered, what incentives are there to behave in a certain way, right? If you have incentives set up where, I don't know, like an incentive bonus structure, where if your project is more profitable, then you're going to personally be more profitable. And I worked at a firm that instituted this policy. And what happened was mentorship stopped because people stopped bringing junior architects on trips or site visits, right? Simulation stopped because they didn't want the extra work to get the daylight right built to their project. But instead, if you create incentives for performance, for questioning, for investigating the best answer, you'll end up with the best answer. Sustainability is always the lowest priority. It's always just naturally disincentivized. And the reason is because from compared to qualities like aesthetic design or budget or schedule, the impacts of your choices around sustainability are not immediately felt, right? If you design an ugly building, people will know and you will suffer the consequences of that, right? If the project goes over budget or over schedule, people know immediately and you suffer the consequences of that. But if you make decisions that results in somebody else getting sick from some chemical in the building in 5 years, nobody ever knows, right? And that leads to us putting less effort into those ideas. So from the perspective of a firm, we need to intentionally incentivize sustainable design, right? Material selection, our energy performance, daylighting, whatever it is, because if we say nothing, they'll be disincentivized. And there's the slide that describes that, right? The consequences of design decisions related to sustainability or distance in time and space, right? I'm going to use a little less energy on this building. That's going to result in less carbon in the atmosphere. Maybe the sea level will rise a little bit less over the next century, right? It's all really, really important stuff, but there's no personal feedback. That's why at the level of a practice, we have to be very intentional about what we think is important. And this extends to the pinup wall, which I spent a good amount of time talking about in the book, right? This is where we signal priorities and values within an architecture firm. When someone pins up their work and we say, this is good, this is bad, that's what that person's to be thinking about when they go back to their desk and focus on for the next week, right? If we ask questions like, how's the air quality of the space? How is the carbon performance? That's the lesson that people, that's the priority that people will internalize. We purely talk about aesthetics during a pinup, and that's what the signal sent is, that's the only thing that matters. So part 3, design, how do we transform practice? The third part of the book goes through design strategies, and it's the kind of the bulk of the book. It's about half, more than half of the book is this part 3. And rather than an approach like, I don't know, maybe the framework design excellence or even a LEED checklist or a living building challenge checklist, which looks at outcomes, energy, water, sites, whatever. What I try to do is prioritize building systems, similar to the way I described earlier, kind of connecting building systems to outcomes. So I highlight 10 building systems, which I think are the most impactful for all these good quality outcomes that we want to achieve, and then try to highlight the strategies that are most important, right? This starts with windows. Getting the windows right is probably the most fundamental strategy for any project. Looks at the structural system, which is where you have the largest opportunity to impact embodied carbon. The electrical system, electrification being incredibly important so that we can kind of operate a clean economy in the future. And then I add in a few atypical systems. I consider the building occupants to be a system, and we can design in a way that encourages the building occupants to design one way or another way and influence the outcomes of the project. I include trees as a building system, because if we think about how they either shade or provide ecosystem services such as stormwater retention, we can improve our projects with natural systems. And then we can combine that all into kind of a great work of architecture that focuses on what's important, but doesn't lose sight of kind of what we all care about design, right? The aesthetics, the poetry, the meaning, the feeling when you're in the space, right? None of that is lost. In fact, a lot of that is gained by focusing on these important things throughout. So I'll end with, this is a quote from the foreword of the book. So I didn't write this, but I thought it was a good way of kind of summarizing this all up. So the transition from today's destructive ways of living to something better has often been framed as self-denial. What are we willing to give up, right? Instead, what I try to ask in this book is, what are we willing to gain, right? Would you be willing to have buildings that are more joyful, more beautiful, more comfortable? Would you be willing to pay less on utilities? Would you be willing to spend more time in buildings that helped you move and be healthier, and in communities where everything's close by and everyone felt welcome? I think if we eliminate the scarcity mindset, I think if we reconsider cost as priorities, and we design buildings that actually live up to their potential, convince our clients what that potential is, and kind of let us take buildings there, I think we can transform our practice, and through that, really our climate, our society, all these things that are connected to our building. So anyway, I found this cartoon. I think the book has a lot of valuable things in it. I encourage you to read it. I learned a lot around sustainability for kind of working in this field and working with a lot of different firms and clients over the past decade. And every single thing that I know, I put in this book. And my intention is that it truly is a practical guide for realizing architecture potential and transforming the profession. So, again, book's a team effort. So I want to thank my publisher, my wife and illustrator, Elena, Bora, for supporting this book tour, and all of you for coming today. Thank you so much. So we'll do some Q&A. Susie has the microphone if anyone has a question.
Anybody?
It could be around anything around sustainability, or even not about sustainability. Everything is basically about sustainability.
Mike tells me this is on.
So, can you give us an example of the most dramatic example of how the principles you're describing manifested in a building and achieved the kind of success that you're promoting?
So it's actually not as exotic as it might seem, right? Most buildings 100 years ago did these things. So we're often in buildings that sequester carbon, that provide great daylight, that provide great air quality. It's actually a lot of the problems emerged over the past 100 years. So visit any historic building, any building that's probably over 100 years old, and you're going to see passive strategies in action. You're probably going to see excellent daylighting. You're going to see materials that were locally harvested. A lot of the things that we are today looking for technology to answer are not really based in technology, right? They were based in the design strategies that used to be necessary and now got rebranded as sustainable design strategies for when we feel like doing that. So I'm not asking for this fundamentally new exotic architecture. I think that was the mistake of the 70s and the airships that I showed. But what we would be looking for is strategies like a building depth that allows light on both sides, right? A structural system that is either wood or kind of light and elegant and works with the forces of gravity, and natural materials that people like to be in contact with. So I think there's a lot of examples out there, but unfortunately not as many newer ones as we would like, but we are starting to move in that direction. Yes.
Yeah. Maybe it's a little negative, but I think that one of our biggest problems is the financial system. And
For guests that can.
oh, okay. So the financial system doesn't support, smaller and better. It doesn't support the kinds of changes that you're suggesting. So we need to educate. We need to educate the banks and the lenders, and stop the real estate people from shouting about 6,000 square feet and 14 bedrooms.
How many bedrooms can we fit in here? I think that's a huge point. I think that's really important. And I've worked with clients who have designed. I hear this a lot with some consulting clients that I have who work in Aspen or like very wealthy areas, where the code allows you to build up to 12,000 square feet, including a 6,000 square foot basement. So we are going to take every single square inch of that. And obviously that's a problem. And but it's a problem of the financial system, right? Because what the loans are getting from the bank, it's also a problem of our cultural values, right? These are very, very wealthy people. They don't need to maximize their return on investment from a single home ski resort home in Aspen, right? The fact that they feel like they do need is a cultural problem that we have as a society. If everybody designed the home, and just talking about residential architecture, if everyone designed the home that they wanted for themselves rather than being focused on resale, all of our homes would be better, right? And the resale value would probably be higher because nobody wants like 40 teeny bedrooms crammed into whatever square footage. So the way that I respond to that is like, sure, we could talk to the financial systems about that, but as architects, we can also talk to our clients about their choices. And I think that architects, in many ways, are an arbiter of culture, right? And we can say to our clients, that's gaudy, right? Like, you don't want to live like that, right? You want to live in this more refined way where quality is actually not scale, but real quality. And I think we have a lot of influence on our clients when we describe kind of lifestyle and different ways of living. When we don't just hear 14,000 square feet and be like, sure, here's a drawing of 14,000 square feet. Like, can we question what is being asked of us? I was working with an architect in San Francisco that does single family residential projects and Feldman architecture. And they wanted to think about how we can approach carbon specifically from a single family perspective. And what they put together was this idea of a carbon budget. So every client that shows up, they introduce them to this idea of a carbon budget and say, well, we only work within a budget of 100 tons of carbon, both operational and embodied, over a 10-year period. And we're going to design your house within that budget. And the reaction from clients has been very, very positive. It's been, okay, that sounds great. It hasn't been, no, I want what I want whatever. They're like, yeah, let's do it. Because they provided a design constraint where there previously wasn't one, and design constraints could lead to more creativity or whatever else, right? And the firm was worried about losing clients because of this, but they said they may or may not have lost any, but they've gained more than they've lost because people are looking for this kind of just like this meaningful approach to sustainability from a high-end residential perspective. So anyway, not exactly answering your question, but hopefully some thoughts about how we could kind of talk about these ideas, not self-censor ourselves, and kind of remain active participants within the design process. Yes.
Coming.
Yeah, I'm curious, like how do you expand, like you talked about the potential of all these different aspects of the building, and how do you expand the scope of what the project is? And how do you engage a client with the potential of the people in it, the potential of systems that might not be part of the traditional scope of architecture?
I think a lot of that is so there's this danger of describing sustainability through the lens of altruism, which I think we should always avoid, right? And we should always describe sustainability or design through the lens of the practical value that the client gets. And it just so happens that a lot of strategies that result in practical value for the client are also good for everybody else. So though we get to be altruistic with our design, that's not the primary focus. And if we say that, and if we use an argument like, what about the polar bears, right? Or what about the CO2 levels? Like, we're not going to win that. My experience, most of my career has been in Texas, and I recently moved to Portland, Oregon. And I thought the response to sustainable design from clients would be drastically different, but it was really not. It was all the exact same. It was like, it's like we either like this or we don't want this, but we can't afford it. And you obviously can't afford something that you don't see the value in, right? And as soon as you see the value in it, you're like, oh yeah, maybe actually I do want that, because your priorities changed. So, so maybe I got far away from the initial question, but I think that we don't broaden. I think we've broadened our view. I don't think we broadened our view with our design approach. I think we're laser focused on what we want to achieve, but the outcomes are broader when we do the right thing, kind of by our client. Yeah.
I was just curious how you see rating systems as a tool to be used. You sort of touched on, the extremes of LBC versus LEED, but with all of these different things that are getting added in, especially like within the framework for design excellence. Now we're talking about material sourcing, and there's design for freedom. We're talking about universal design, and there's the Kelsey. And how do you see these being used most optimally to help support a project? Because on any project, there's only so many
things.
rating systems, certifications, things that you can convince a client to go after. So just would love to hear a little more about your thoughts about the dynamic of like capitalizing on those.
Yeah, so I mean, I would divide those into two different things, right? There's rating systems like LEED, LBC, and then there's tools like the framework or the material pledge or universal design guidelines. I'm pretty pessimistic about rating systems in general. I think that they're mostly distractions that lead us down into weird paths and avoid a kind of a consistent vision of what we want to achieve, which should come. It's like we're outsourcing our values to someone else and their spreadsheet, and I don't think we should do that. Now, sometimes rating systems are useful. And if the client says they want to do LEED, I wouldn't say no, but I would not elevate that into I would consider that more like code, like something that we'll do in the background. I still think we need to lead with a vision, and the vision needs to be pretty concise and focused. So in the book, I talk a lot about the value of goal setting, and I think goal setting is kind of the most fundamental and most important piece of sustainable design. And if you set a few goals, either with the client or just on your own with your design team that you share with the client, and then build stories around them and get the team excited about it and get the client excited about it, you can accomplish really great things. And the example that I always give is like, there are so many weird, bad designs out there, but somebody got excited about a story, and that's why it ended up happening. So why can't we get people excited about a story that results in a good design? So for instance, the framework for design excellence, I think, is a great way of kind of brainstorming, using the framework to brainstorm around goal setting. So like, are we doing something in this area? Are we doing something in this area? And maybe you don't then kind of pursue all 10 things. Maybe there's like 2 or 3 or 4 that are especially important. And then you use that to build your primary goals for the project. Or similarly, like design for freedom, universal act, like if these are primary goals, which they should be, like you can use those tools to inform what your goals are. The one opinion that I have about, like the one rating system that I do think has a lot of value is Passive House. And I would pursue clients to pursue a Passive House project for really any project. And I would pursue a Passive House mentality for projects that aren't achieving it. A lot of rating systems like LBC or like LEED, I think they still have the mindset where you design a building and then you tack features onto it, right? And then your cost blows up, right? But so it's almost like sustainability applied to a project, where Passive House is like fundamentally a different building, a different concept of approaching thermal comfort and indoor air quality and the priorities of how much money you invest in different buckets. So that's a different, and one other difference is kind of outcome based versus prescription based. So one more thought on kind of a long answer is a lot of these tools can be useful, but also could be distracting. And you really want to kind of avoid the overloading of everything, right? And it might be prioritize different things on different projects. So hopefully that helps. There's a new tool or rating system coming out in a minute, and like we're not going to design better buildings by learning all of them.
I have a question for you.
Susie.
And then Peter, sorry, Peter.
Yeah.
So and we talked about this a little bit earlier today, but what's next? I mean, we've gotten great at efficiency. We've gotten great at the low hanging fruit. California's got it's going in the right direction with our energy grid. What's next? What are we reaching
What are
for
we
now?
grasping for now?
Yeah. And what are we bringing into our projects now that will advance reducing carbon mostly?
Yeah, I mean, so from a carbon standpoint, the big things are electrification and your structural system. And I think that as a profession, we're now talking more about carbon. A lot of people talk about calculating carbon, which I have mixed thoughts on because it's super complicated. But the fundamental strategies are fairly straightforward, which is we need to electrify our buildings and we need to design less carbon intensive structures. The way you design less carbon intensive structures is mass timber is one option, or just wood in general. Another option is just more efficient structures, right? You might kind of avoid dramatic overhangs, and we might celebrate a column instead, which can cut all this cross bracing out, for instance. And then from a electrification standpoint, because electricity is going to be less energy dense than burning fossil fuels on site, we need to have more efficient buildings to make electrification work. So that kind of forces us to have better enclosures, to have maybe more compact forms. And then from the perspective of something like daylighting or kind of human joy or comfort or whatever, we need to have narrower buildings so that we're not like in a sea, we have access to the outdoors, we have access to fresh air, we have access to windows. So I think that over time, the buildings that we want to design are actually coming a little closer together. There's maybe less regional diversity even. We want heat pumps, we want efficient enclosures, we want good forms, maybe wood, and we want access to the outdoors. Yes. Oh, and then Peter, you're next.
Oh.
No, go ahead.
My question is along the lines of access, and I tried to read as much as I could before today, but I just found out about your book a couple days ago. So I apologize if there's like a whole chapter on this and I just haven't gotten to it yet. But in terms of access, I was wondering, because I think you already mentioned a little bit of what I've read about aging in place and just access for folks with disabilities, or, just as we age, like how we're interested from a client perspective, we're interested in an ADU for my parents, and then, eventually like for ourselves. And so we're trying to think about anticipating like, just decreases in mobility. And I am curious about access in terms of that, because we live in like a really nice neighborhood with green space, except for like almost no one has a driveway because a lot of the houses were built before everybody had cars, and that makes sense. But then it's really hard to get in and out of like where we live. And then once you're there, we actually have a plot where we're like, I think we could get something in here that you could use the wheelchair in, so we're trying to figure out all these different things. And I'm just wondering where, I guess disability access, I'm not even sure how to talk about it really, would come into play in terms of your access and health.
Right, like universal
conversation.
design kind of piece. Well, obviously super important. And I actually want to touch on that in relation to the question about kind of what is an exemplary projects? And I mentioned some historic projects. So the goal is not obviously to go back to 100 years ago, because we've learned a lot since then, right? So we maybe forgot some things about daylighting and material sourcing, but we've learned a lot about things like universal design. And one of my favorite, there was this kind of great cartoon, or I don't know, diagram, something about universal design, which showed like somebody in a wheelchair, somebody pushing a stroller, somebody pushing a bicycle. And it's all like the same space requirements. It's like super important. So, so definitely something that we need to kind of work on in all of our projects. I think that we obviously need to make our built environment accessible to everybody with mobility issues. But we have to recognize that people have kids that push strollers, and that we want everybody to use bicycles. So it means that paths have to be a certain width and doors have to be a certain access. And we need to think about ramps differently than we used to. And we have to think about thresholds differently than we used to. So not like a huge amount to add, other than it's super, super important. And that is part of what is defining like design excellence in our modern era, is not just creating buildings that harm people less, but also inviting more people, right? And kind of make our spaces universally accessible.
Thank you, Corey. I read your book. My technique, though, I say I read it, I gave myself 3 hours to go cover to cover. But that's actually a measurable book in its own way. I promise I'm going to go back, but it really, it is refreshing in the sense that it says, hey, as architects, we already have the tools, right? We don't really have to hunt around the next thing. The consultants are good, all that stuff, but we have a toolkit already that we can do 85%, and we should just do what we can do.
We should just do the 85%. Yeah.
And we should frame, and we're good at framing the value proposition. So there's so much good stuff in here. I'm going to go to a subject that I just was struggling with in the meeting I just came from. That is hard to deal with project by project. I'm going to talk about vinyl a little more. So the affordable housing business, which is what I'm dealing with, I'm in mostly right now. oh my God, vinyl is just a wonderful material. It's so freaking
cheap.
durable. It comes
so
in every
durable.
color. It's cheap. You don't have to replace it for a long time. It's impossible to talk clients out of it. It was a godsend when we got rid of carpet in affordable housing, which largely we have because you don't have the dust problems. So I just can't waste my breath on that, you know. So, but there's got to be something upstream because electrification is happening because upstream from all of us, there was legislation, right? So I'm kind of curious then your thoughts about how this translates into some collective things, right? And maybe how we get our clients to help us, but how we do that.
So I'll share a quick story about vinyl. I was recently working on an affordable housing project in Portland, and we were walking through the cost estimate with the design team and the client and the contractor, and they were going line item by line item, and they got down to flooring, and they said, okay, and we're going to have a $200,000 premium for your bio-based resilient flooring. And the client said, why are we doing that? And the design team, it was like, I don't know, 4 or 5 of us in the room that spans principal in charge down to junior level designer. One after one gave the case about why we're not going to put vinyl, why the $200,000 premium for the bio-based stuff is worthwhile, aligns with the client's vision, the harm the vinyl cause. And it was presented, and obviously the team had training on this, but it was presented kind of in that moment so confidently and so authoritatively that the conversation ended. And the client said, basically, obviously, okay, thank you for informing me. And then we moved on, and the question never came up again. So I don't think that it's impossible to get rid of vinyl and floor. I think that the key here was just the confidence with which the design team delivered this message. And it wasn't like, we'll check on that and we'll get back, we'll see if we can fit it in the budget. It was like, no, we're not going to do that because of the health impacts related to the people who live in the building or whatever else. And so the analogy that I gave earlier, when I was speaking with another group earlier, was we don't VE the roof on a building, right? Like the contractor can be like, well, I got this great idea. We can cut $500,000 of the project. We're just not going to build a roof, right? And nobody would ever say that. And if the contractor did say that, they wouldn't entertain it because it's kind of just self-evident that a building needs a roof. It provides a certain value, a certain function, and we're willing to pay for that function. Can we get to the point where not putting poisonous materials in our building is as self-evident as putting in a roof in the building? Right? And it's just standard. And we just don't do that. And we stop saying $200,000 premium. We just say that's the cost of a building that people are going to be in. So it's going to take a lot of work. A big challenge with vinyl is that it's a byproduct of other manufacturing processes. So it's abundant and cheap. And that's the reason it's abundant and cheap. And we're never going to run out of it. And hopefully there's legislation around it. But I think as architects, we can make a convincing case. And I saw it happen for the first time recently. It was like the high point of my professional career. And I was just like, yeah, right. So it's possible. Yeah.
Just piggybacking onto that, Corey, the AIA Code of Ethics, says that we should talk to our clients about these things. And so I'm curious if you've used that in practice, with, internally in your office or externally to address things like vinyl flooring.
We could. I mean, the way the Code of Ethics is written is like inform your clients on the environmental impacts of their decision. I would love the Code of Ethics to say, don't put poison in the building, right? I think the Code of Ethics should say that. And maybe that's what it takes to kind of to end the conversation. But yeah, it could be a really valuable tool. I mean, we definitely have to be, if a client wants something that we think is no good, it is our ethical obligation to explain why. And I think we should be doing that probably more than we're doing right now. Probably one more question because we're right up around 7. Well, thank you so much for coming. We have some book sales. I'll even sign them if you're interested. But thank you so much, everyone.